But as we talk about the sins that we're guilty of and that we're forgiven through Christ for all those who place their faith in him, we also have to address issues that people feel guilty about that aren't necessarily their fault. In a room this size, statistically speaking, I don't know your guys' background or anything, but statistically speaking, there are people in this room that statistic would say have been sexually abused. And I want to address specifically the feelings of guilt that many people who are victims of sexual abuse often feel, struggling with this idea of somehow was it their fault that it happened to them. I just want to share with you from Scripture. In Deuteronomy chapter 22, this whole chapter in Deuteronomy in the Old Testament is all about what to do when you catch people in adultery. Short answer is put them to death, okay? Which is the wages of all sin, by the way. But later on, God makes it very clear that in the instance of a woman, and this could also apply to men or women who are sexually abused, but in this case is a woman who is found in a field, no witnesses around, and a man comes and rapes her. And she cries for help, it says in Deuteronomy chapter 22. It says she cries for help and there's no one to hear her. God specifically tells them, because the natural tendency for them would be, well, we got to kill them, right? God made it very clear to them. You kill the attacker, the man in this case, and you do nothing to the woman, for she has committed no sin worthy of death. You know what kind of hope this gives to victims of sexual abuse? Because I believe, once again, this is talked about in many articles and many witnesses, is that everybody cries out in some sense when they're abused. It may not be audible. Sometimes they'll report being in an out-of-body experience where they're in complete shock and they're being protected in that sense, where they're being removed from their body, the out-of-body experience, and they're still crying out internally. But this one passage gives victims hope that God sees what's done in secret. You know, another phrase that's how that whole passage ends is you treat it in the same case as a murder, where even if someone was murdered in secret, you would only kill the murderer, stone him to death, put him to death. Only he is to be punished. Well, obviously the other person's already dead. But in the same case as a murder, you wouldn't do anything to the victim. They haven't done anything wrong. I've never heard of a murder case where people said, oh, well, that was that person's fault. That's why they got murdered. It was their fault. I've never heard anyone say that. But sadly, I have heard people say, well, that person deserved it in sexual abuse cases. Or that person shouldn't have put themselves in that situation. Or that person should have done more. But you would never say that for a murder case. You would never say, oh, that person deserved to get murdered. But here, God, who sees what is done in secret, relates it to that of a murder. You would never place the blame on the victim. There's another place that we see where Jesus tells us how to pray. He says, don't pray where everyone can hear what you're saying and you're trying to show off. He says, pray, go to your inner room, pray, where your Father in heaven hears and sees what's done in secret. When a woman in Genesis cried out to God, she called God the God who sees when she felt abandoned and alone. To her in that moment, God was the God who sees. So when we talk about the gospel message, you see, there are so many sins that we're guilty of. We have all committed adultery in our hearts. We've all committed murder in our hearts. We have sinned so much in our hearts. But God wanted to make it very clear. For the victims of abuse, that is something that you are not guilty of. And my prayer for you, if you're struggling with holding these feelings of guilt, somehow it was your fault or somehow you should have done more, God is the God who sees. He knows that that was not something that you desired to happen to you. What's the first purpose of sex? Pleasure. mutual, consensual pleasure. That's what it's supposed to represent. That's the opposite of abuse.